Hola a todos y bienvenidos. Welcome back to Real Fast Spanish. In this video, we're going to break down the 4 must-know uses of the Spanish pronoun se. Now, se is a tricky grammar topic, but a very important one since se is the most common pronoun in Spanish. And to make it easier for you, it can help if we start with a sentence you are already familiar with. And so we're going to start this video with the question, ¿Cómo se dice? And this means how is it said or how does one say it? Now, I know that not every student will have seen this question before, but it is a common question and most beginners I've worked with over the years know how to use it. So if you want to know how to say something in Spanish and the person you are talking with speaks both English and Spanish, you can ask, ¿Cómo se dice? Something like this. You can say, ¿Cómo se dice mobile en español? Or, ¿Cómo se dice pen en español? And the person could respond, el móvil and el bolígrafo. But then if you're talking with someone who doesn't speak English at all, you can simply ask, ¿Cómo se dice esto en español? ¿Cómo se dice esto en español? Which is, how do you say this in Spanish? Then if you have maybe a word written on a piece of paper, you could ask, ¿Cómo se dice esta palabra? How do you say this word? Or maybe if you're driving in a taxi and you want to know how to say a long name on a street sign, you could ask, ¿Cómo se dice el nombre de esta calle? How do you say the name of this street? Then, on top of adding words, another way we can get to know this use of se better is we can substitute words. We can take the verb decir and replace it with the verb llamar, for example, to call. So then we would get, ¿Cómo se llama? How does one call it? Or a more natural translation to English might be like, what is it called? So then instead we could say, ¿Cómo se llama esto en español? What is this called in Spanish? Then in plural form, if you had a bunch of things, for example, if you had a bunch of things like these carabiners, you could ask, ¿Cómo se llaman estos en español? What are these called in Spanish? So instead of ¿Cómo se llama, we say ¿Cómo se llaman? We make it plural, and instead of esto for this, estos for these. And for those that are curious, a carabiner in Spanish is el mosquetón, and the plural, los mosquetones. Next, you could replace decir or llamar with any other verb that you know in the language. So for example, ¿Cómo se hace? How is it done? ¿Cómo se escribe? How is it written or how is it spelled? ¿Cómo se pronuncia? How is it pronounced? Imagine you're in a restaurant and they serve you a strange dish and you're not sure if you should eat it with your hands or with a fork or something. You could say, ¿Cómo se come? How is it eaten? Or how does one eat this? Now, another useful idea is to create a compound phrase, and compound phrases are one of the most important tactics for beginners to know. I've done a whole video on compound phrases and I'll leave a link below in the description. But in short, a compound phrase is when we combine 2 verbs together in the same sentence. So we could start with something like ¿Cómo se puede? How can one? And then we can add any verb you can think of. So ¿Cómo se puede comer? How can it be eaten? ¿Cómo se puede encontrar? How can it be found? ¿Cómo se puede pagar? How can one pay? Right? Then, for example, imagine you're in a department store and you aren't sure where you can pay. You might be able to go up to a security guard and ask something like, ¿Dónde se puede pagar? Where can one pay? So we can kind of take that ¿cómo and replace it with a different question word. Now we can even change this around. Like, imagine you were like, just wanted to confirm, like, do you pay over there? Or does one pay over there? ¿Se puede pagar por allí? Now, all of these examples that we've seen so far is the first use of se in Spanish, and I like to refer to these as the impersonal se, meaning that anyone can do these things. The se represents one or anyone. Now, in English, we often use you in impersonal sentences like I just did a moment ago. Where do you pay for these? But it doesn't make sense to ask a security guard in Spanish, ¿Dónde pagas tú? Because he will think like, but hang on a minute, it's you paying, not me. So that's why we want to use se whenever we're talking in an impersonal way in Spanish. Now, the next way the pronoun se will appear in Spanish is in the passive voice. And I like to refer to this as the passive se. Now, a good example of this would be a sentence like, the house was built in 2008. So who built the house? Was it built by my uncle? Was it built by a construction company? In this case, it was someone specific. But it doesn't matter in our sentence because we only care about when the house was built, So we remove the person or people from the sentence. This is what makes it passive in both English and Spanish. Now we can translate this literally. We can say, La casa fue construida en 2008. But this can sound a little awkward in spoken Spanish. When natives are conversing, they will tend to use the passive se, which looks like this. La casa se construyó en 2008. Now, in terms of meaning, these Spanish sentences are interchangeable, but when you are speaking, it is better to use the se option because it is much more common. Now, I know the first form looks much more like English, so students may have a preference for this. But to help you get more comfortable with the second form, the more common option, we can break it down and think about it like this. If we add the person back into the sentence, so say it was my uncle here. My uncle built the house in 2008. Mi tío construyó la casa en 2008. Now we can translate word for word between English and Spanish. But then you can just think, if we want to remove mi tío from the sentence, we have to replace it with se. So, mi tío becomes se construyó la casa en 2008. And here, the order with casa doesn't matter. We can say se construyó la casa or la casa se construyó. It just means the house was built. So when you're learning the passive form of se, it can help to add that person back in, look at it in English, and then take it out and add se. Another example? Well, this is what needs to be done. Bueno, esto es lo que se necesita hacer.
Bueno, esto es lo que se necesita hacer.
Now again, we can use the same trick. Imagine the thing that needs to be done by our mutual friend Carlos. We can then add him into the sentence. Bueno, esto es lo que Carlos necesita hacer. This can make it look a lot more like English, but then we want to remove Carlos because we don't want to put the pressure on him to do the work, or maybe it could be done by someone other than Carlos, someone else in the family or the friendship group. So we can then replace Carlos with se. Esto es lo que se necesita hacer. Now, a question we often get from students is, how do I know if this is the impersonal or passive se? Because this sentence looks a lot like the impersonal, right? Well, in reality, the definition doesn't matter when you are speaking Spanish. As a student, you just need to recognize that the subject of the sentence has been removed. The house was built. This needs to be done. By who? The who is gone from the sentence. And so we just replace it with the pronoun se. Now, whether it can be done by anyone or someone specific, the structure looks very similar. And the next use of se is in reflexive verbs. We can call this the reflexive se. Our common reflexive verb might be the verb to wake up. So the conjugations will look like this. I wake up, me despierto. You wake up, te despiertas. He or she wakes up, se despierta. We wake up, nos despertamos. They wake up, se despiertan. Now, in reflexive verbs, we can think of the me, the te, and the se as myself, yourself, himself, herself, etc. And then if we focus on the third person forms, we have he wakes himself, she wakes herself, se despierta. They wake themselves, se despiertan. So this use of se is quite different to the impersonal and passive forms because now the person is definitely in the sentence. So an example might be, my wife goes to bed at 9 every night. Mi esposa se acuesta a las 9 cada noche. Now we can think of this as she lays herself down, where se is representing herself. Now another example in plural form, my parents get along really well. Mis papás se llevan bien.
Papás se llevan bien.
Next, the fourth use of se is when direct and indirect objects combine. And we can call this the combined objects se. So if we take a sentence like, I'm going to give him the backpack, voy a darle la mochila. If we replace backpack in the case that someone asks me, hey, Andrew, are you going to give the backpack to him? Then I can say, yes, I'm going to give it to him. So now it's tempting just to replace la mochila with la, and we get sí, voy a darle la. But in Spanish, whenever le and lo or le and la go next to each other, we actually replace the le with a se. So this becomes sí, voy a dársela. Another example, we have to give them the tickets. Tenemos que darles los billetes. And then if someone asks you, have you given the tickets to them? I say, no, we have to give them to them. No tenemos que darles los doesn't work in Spanish. We have to say, no tenemos que dárselos. Now, any combination of pronouns that you can think of, lelo, lela, lelos, lelas, leslo, lesla, leslos, leslas, then they all become celo, cela, celos, celas, etc. And as a quick aside, I used to teach this, and there's an article on the blog that I'm going to talk about later where I would say that the reason this happens is because it's easier to say. And I say, if you say les, los 3 times fast, it actually feels easier to say celos, les, los doy versus celos doy. It's much easier to say it like that. But as what happens when you write a blog, thousands of people read an article and every now and then someone will come along and actually say, hey, by the way, this thing that you're explaining isn't quite right. And a student a few years ago wrote to me and said there was a book that was written on the history of Spanish and how it developed. And they said this is one of the biggest myths in Spanish education, is saying that the reason that les, los contracts to celos is because it's easier to say. It turns out that it was actually just a case that when the words translated from Latin, then into Spanish, and then there was another change which took something that was very unusual to me to the modern form of celos that we get used to today. So it isn't necessarily the case that it's easier to say that's why it happened. It was a change that happened in the 16th century. Now, all of that said, while it technically isn't true that the reason that we say celos is because it's easier, the reason, again, has to do with etymology, I still think it's a useful way to teach it. So I still like to say to students, this isn't technically true, but you can remember it by thinking that it's easier to say celos than leslos. But let me know in the comments if you think that's a good way of describing it. Regardless of why it's the case, this is what we need to remember. Now, it's also worth noting that these combinations can go at the start or the end of any compound phrase. For example, I want to say it to him could be quiero decírselo, or se lo quiero decir. Now, in addition to this video, I just mentioned a moment ago, I've written an article where you can find more examples and a downloadable PDF that you can use as a study reference of the 4 uses of se. Now, something else that I didn't discuss in this video is the subtle difference between the reflexive and the reciprocal verbs in that 3rd use, the reflexive se, because I was worried that this video was getting a little long, but I've put all of the details in the article and I'll leave a link below in the description. So thanks so much for watching. Any feedback, of course, please let me know in the comments. And until next time, hasta pronto.